Welcome all. Thank you for joining us. My name's Margaret Rawls. I work in the programs department here at the Cathedral. We're so glad you're joining us for this evening's Honest to God with Barbara Brown Taylor. If you're just hearing me, that's completely right. I'm just this voice in the background. We're going to get started in just a minute, but I wanted to go over some of our best practices. So if you have a technical question, if you can't hear or you can't see, you can use the chat function in the bottom of your screen on that little icon bar. It's a little speech bubble. Feel free to just drop any concerns you have there, and we'll be monitoring that and can address them. The other feature we're going to use this evening is the Q&A function. So if you have any questions for Barbara Brown Taylor, the second half of our program will be taking questions from there. You can drop them in that function. It's the two little speech bubbles on that icon bar. So again, the two functions we're using is the chat function and that Q&A function. If you have any questions or you can't find the Q&A function, you can always drop anything in that chat function and we'll get to it. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for joining us on Facebook Live as well. If you have any questions for our speakers there, you can ask them in the chat function as well, or in the comments. Thanks all.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Honest to God conversation with Barbara Brown Taylor. My name's Randy Hollerith, Dean of the Cathedral, and it's a joy to be with all of you tonight from around the country. I see we've got over 350 folks gathered so far, and that's just on Zoom, not to mention the other folks joining us on YouTube. God bless you all, and thank you for being with us. One of the great joys for me in doing these Honest to God conversations, the way we're doing them now, is that before this pandemic, we would have several Honest to God conversations over a year period in the Cathedral building. But now that we're doing them digitally, we can do them much more often. And we've been having some really wonderful conversations. And I've been looking forward to having some conversation with our guest tonight, Barbara Brown Taylor. Her books, she's written over a dozen, well over a dozen books. Her books and her sermons have been deeply meaningful for so many of us in the church and far beyond the church. But we're also proud of her within the Episcopal circles for her gifts as an Episcopal priest, not to mention her many gifts as a writer and as a teacher. So as we begin tonight, I want to read you her biography. So for those of you who may not know as much about Barbara Brown Taylor, just to bring you up to date. So Barbara Brown Taylor is a best-selling author, teacher, and Episcopal priest. Her first memoir, Leaving Church, won an Author of the Year award from the Georgia Writers Association in 2006. Her next two books, An Altar in the World, 2010, and Learning to Walk in the Dark, 2015, are in places on the New York Times bestseller list. She served on the faculties of Piedmont College, Columbia Theological Seminary, Candler School of Theology at Emory University, McAfee School of Theology at Mercer University, and the Certificate in Theological Studies program at Arendale State Prison for Women in Alto, Georgia. In 2014, Time magazine included her on its annual list of the most influential people. And in 2015, she was named Georgia Woman of the Year. In 2016, she received the President's Medal at the Chautauqua Institution in New York. And her 14th book, Holy Envy, was released by Harper One in March 2019. Barbara, welcome. We're so glad to have you. How you doing?
I'm so happy to be visualized because we didn't think that would happen. I live way in the middle of nowhere, and it's raining, and usually that wrecks my party line. So I'm happy to see you and really happy for the opportunity to be here.
Well, we're so glad to have you. And if the video gets rough and we and you want to cut it off, it's quite all right. We'll continue, with our voices back and forth. But thank you for taking the time to be with us. I know it means a lot to the folks who are joining us, and to me especially. So how are you doing during this strange time in which we're living? Talk to me about that a little bit.
I moved to the country in 1992, and social distancing is built into farm life. So my next door neighbor is as far away as she has ever been. And not a lot has changed. I drive 9 miles into town for my groceries, but now I wear a mask. And I'm also a person of retirement age. And I have found those two things, living rurally and being retired and figuring out I can live on Social Security, have made this a whole different kind of crisis for me than it has been for other people. And did I mention I'm an introvert? So there are a lot of ways in which I have to read the news every morning, which I do, almost like morning and evening prayer, just to remember how different other people's realities are, both in cities in this country and around the world.
A lot of folks are really taking to this sort of digital connection that we're doing, and a lot of other folks aren't taking to it so well. And I sort of have a mixed bag with it. I get exhausted from Zoom conversations, meetings all day long. Do you like this kind of digital life that we're living?
I like audio a lot. I love podcasts, but as you can see, you're in my ironing room, and I wasn't sure we'd be on video. So it's a real pain to clean up the ironing room for these things. And I haven't figured out any of the higher tech biz. All I know is I'm supposed to wear a shirt with a collar, and kind of keep my head up. So the video stuff is alarming. Plus, you and I have talked about this, preparing for this conversation, that I couldn't figure out why my broadcast was so bad. And then I finally ran an internet speed and found out I have 10 millibytes per second. That's maximum available in my area, which puts me in 9% of Georgians without any fiber optic ability. There's one service provider in my area. And I wrote the second one who provides fiber optic, and they said for $10,000, they'd run the fiber 2 miles. So I decided I could live without it. But it has been a real wake-up call as people switch into Zoom function. And I realize how many people don't have that opportunity. Again, I live, with a lot of benefits, but there are certainly poor teenagers in Georgia who finished their final exams sitting in Chick-fil-A parking lots where they could get on a laptop with a signal. So that's been a sobering hello to what's being called the digital divide, right? So I'm caught in it with enough experience of it to have some empathy.
This virus has exposed a lot of the divides, we've known they were there, but it has really exacerbated so many of the divides in our country, whether it's access to medical care or the digital divide, as you're talking about, that combined with so much loss has made it a really difficult period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I found healthcare professionals at the top of my prayer list, the people who way past the point of exhaustion just kept showing up for work. Remarkable people. The term sacrifice, vocational sacrifice, clergy got to have that for a while, but right now it belongs to medicine in my mind.
Absolutely. And they're bearing, not only they're working so hard, but they're having to carry such an emotional load, which I imagine many of them are going to have to process months from now,
It's like it is at least first cousin to veterans who have no one else to talk about what it's like to witness death so incessantly for different reasons, but still, yeah. Things we haven't figured out yet is how do we all return to not normal, but to some kind of balance where we're not waking up in the middle of the night scared to death.
The new abnormal. Yeah. So tell us what you've been doing since 2017, which, as you say on your website, you put down the chalk. So what have you been doing with yourself these past 3 years?
Well, I found out teaching was just about a third of what I did. I thought it was all of what I did. And then it turned out that none of the other deadlines went away. So I've been happily working away at some writing projects and a lot of talking projects. And as I've told some people close to me, I found this whole crowd of younger, mostly millennial people who call themselves like reconstructed Christians or post-evangelicals. That includes Rachel Held Evans, Sarah Bessey, Jeff Chu, a whole crowd of people I've discovered in the last 3 years that I had no reason to find before. So I've had a wonderful time figuring out everything we have in common and then how we've been shaped differently. So I've been so busy that I still haven't cleaned out all my closets. I've been at it for 3 years. And maybe if this pandemic lasts, maybe I just need like 3 more months and maybe I can get through the last closet. But you know,
cleaning out closets is overrated. I'm sorry. I just think
yeah, but you know, I have to think about my heirs. Who are the people in my last will and testament? Because I've been that person, so I'm trying to think about those who come after.
As someone who had a father who was a pack rat, I completely get that. I completely get that. So tell me, what have you been finding in common with these young folks, these sort of this new religious trend? What have you been finding in common? What's been exciting to you about that?
It's been exciting because so much of my later life ministry has been about reconstructing Protestant mainliners about my age, you know, who've been pillars of their churches. Many still are, but they've taken every course. They've finished EFM twice. They, you know, haven't signed up for a master's degree yet, but they flock to weekend conferences that I've come to think of as sort of modern pilgrimage places. And they're all over the country, and they've got names like Awakening Soul and Gladdening Light and Wisdom Ways and January Adventure. So I found remarkably those audiences, which have almost no one under 50 in them, have a lot in common with these audiences who have almost no one over 50 in them. And it is that the faith they grew up on has carried them far. I think some of the post-evangelicals I've met are newer in their sense of having been misled about what's in the Bible and the fullness of the gospel. But honest to goodness, their hunger, their curiosity, their questions match the group that's more my age. So that's been wonderful. And then the odd benefit of the pandemic has been all of a sudden I, you know, Medicare card carrier, have a lot to talk about with my 29-year-old granddaughter or my 31-year-old new friend, because they've been aged prematurely. They want to know what it's like not to be able to drive and to sit in your chair a lot and, you know, to not get much exercise. And all of a sudden, my elder skills come in handy for a whole different set of circumstances. So that has also been fascinating.
I can't believe you're not getting much exercise up there on the farm, though.
Well, yeah, I'll brag about that. I can still carry a 100-pound bale of alfalfa up the steps if I have to, but I'll stop several times along the way. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about your farm, where you live. Do you have a lot of acres, a lot of animals? Is it a working sort of farm, or is it something you do sort of out of a love for that life?
What do they call? There's something like toy farms, hobby farms. This isn't that. This is an organic vegetable farm that works hard to stay certified with the state of Georgia, with 2 or 3 acres. And again, an interesting, odd benefit of the pandemic has been it was the responsibility of one farmer. And now there are 5 or 6 people from the community. We've got a little Tolstoy commune going on here, where people show up and they work in the garden and they go home with kale and sugar snap peas and fresh red leaf lettuce, and they all maintain social distance, and they've all got their chores in the garden. So that's our reason for calling ourselves a farm. But it started out as about 150 acres that my husband and I looked for 2 years. And his requirement was running water, and my requirement was 9 miles from the church I served. And we finally found the perfect launch with this place we now call Indian Ridge Farm. It was just a cow pasture. And now it's got 2 or 3 barns, and it's got a few old broken down horses. I think a hospice for horses is part of my vocation is taking in the broken down racehorses. There's one whose leg I wrap twice a day now after I've cold hosed his leg. Don't think about that too long, what that might mean. But a couple of horses, a couple of dogs, a couple of cats, and tons of chickens, and way too many roosters who just haunt the hens, just stalk them all around the yard. But it's wonderful because I live in these rhythms of sunrise before the sun comes up, and sundown. Doesn't matter whether it's daylight savings or regular, the horses know what time dinner is. So it's a good rhythm and one I'm very grateful for.
It sounds, as someone stuck in DC, it sounds marvelous. Sounds marvelous.
Well, I don't have them all. I'm missing a few museums. No good restaurants here to speak of, one, but everything's for better, for worse, Randy. Everything's for better.
Everything's a trade-off. That's true. I get that. I get that. So I've always wanted to ask you this, you have done some writing about it, but talk a little bit about, if you don't mind, I ask all of our folks this, talk a little bit about your spiritual journey, sort of how you got to where you are right now, and sort of into the priesthood, and then priesthood into, you're always a priest, but into teaching, and then to where you are now. How did God get you to where you are now? What took place?
It's always clear in a rearview mirror, isn't it? But when I wrote Altar in the World a few years back, I had a chapter on getting lost. And I think that's the answer, is that none of my 5-year plans worked out. And so I ended up getting lost, getting lost vocationally, intentionally getting lost geographically scared me to death to move to the country. But over and over again, I was surprised by things that lasted longer than I thought or ran out sooner than I thought. And then new opportunities that opened up just when I had decided I could pump gas or, work at the hardware store. So I'm staying put where I am in the world in this rural county is important to me. And that accounts for the last 2 vocations I've held, that of pastor of a church and teacher at a local, not a local college, but a rural college. So I'm not sure where I would blame the Holy Spirit for any of that, but it does seem to me like I am either consistently choosing or being consistently led into places where I don't know what I'm doing. And that has benefited me enormously, to be a beginner all the time, beginner's mind, always finding something I don't know how to do, or being called to do something I don't know how to do, like this Zoom interview, and then figuring it out and trusting that I am wearing some new neural pathways. But it's been a wonderful thing in my life to flee competency. And when I get really good at something, to go take up something else, because it's always full of surprises and new vocabulary and new skills, new muscle memory, all kinds of things. So I stayed a teacher longer than anything. That was 19 and a half years. So I stayed a teacher of college students longer than anything. But that combined in a lot of ways things I loved most from all the other things I'd done in my life. So it was a lovely place to wind up.
Do you think that this being pulled into new and unfamiliar territory, learning new skills, is that something that you love, or is it something that you've learned to love? Do you feel like the Spirit's pushed you there, or do you think you naturally kind of want to go into that?
Gosh, could I say both? Do I have to choose A or B?
No,
can it be both?
You can do anything you want.
Yeah, there's certainly times I've chosen, and really all I knew, for instance, when I left Atlanta, all I knew was that I had run to the end of the road in urban ministry, that I knew the vocabulary well. I would never have enough gifts to satisfy the requirements of the job, but I knew the vocabulary, I knew the landscape, I knew how to do my job. And at that point, I'd only served one church for 10 years, and it occurred to me, was I ordained to serve church or this church? So I decided to sort of cast a net and look around, though I wanted to stay in the state of Georgia. So let me put brackets around my adventuresomeness. It's very geographically contained and economically secure. So there's, it doesn't match at all. A friend of mine who's adopted 5 extra children, or, people who've traveled the world to volunteer their skills other places. But insofar as, my boundaried life has been, there have been other times when I got pretty happy with what I was doing, and the rug moved, and I was called upon, to manifest some inventiveness that wasn't in my plan. So that has happened at least once, significantly.
When you were in Atlanta, you said that you realized you'd never have all the gifts you needed to do the job. What does that mean? What do you mean by that?
Well, I'm not a parent. I never bore children. I inherited 2 daughters when I married, but I always heard about the good enough parent. I always heard my friends with children talking about how they had to finally make peace with being a good enough parent, because they could never be a good enough parent. They could never exercise, enough protection, education, allow enough freedom. And that transposed easily, though, don't ever call me Mother Taylor. That happened to me once at the University of the South, and I had no idea who they were talking to. Somebody drove up in a little cart and said, "Mother Taylor, want to ride?" And I thought, who is Mother Taylor? So I'm not identifying with that piece, but the sense of responsibility for well-being, the cure of souls, the care of souls, always seemed to me similar between bearing children, being a pastor, that you feel responsible, to be the best carer you can be. And I don't know anyone who's satisfied, with how well they did with that. I know no one who gives themselves an A+ on that.
Amen to that. I get it completely. Well, why do you call yourself a spiritual contrarian?
Oh, I'm such a limited contrarian because I was designing a new website, and you have to come up with something. But Nadja Boltz Weber, do I have tattoos? No. No, I'm not. I mean, there are contrarians out there who put me to shame. But maybe I should put within my age group. Would that be good? I'm a spiritual contrarian within my age group. Though Phyllis Tickle, gave me a run for my money.
Well, maybe you mean you're a spiritual contrarian from where you were.
Well, here's what I think I mean by that, is that a rich, rich place for me to look all my life is first to look in the direction that the majority of people seem to be looking in, religiously, culturally, spiritually, and then turn around and look in the other direction. Look behind me at what's being ignored, because the cultural attention, the religious attention, spiritual attention is elsewhere. And to turn around and look in the other direction is to be a contrarian in some ways. It's to be eccentric. And that has always served me so well, because you end up with the sermon, even you didn't think about preaching, or the sermon that nobody has heard yet, including you. So the contrarianism, if anything, is a habit of resource finding. And I've just learned that if I turn around and around and around and around, I'll see things I don't see when I'm looking straight ahead, trying to kind of follow the trend.
Oh, I love that. I love that analogy. And certainly in your sermons, I mean, so many of us have, just been marveled at your preaching and your abilities as a writer. And so many of them were and are seeing the gospel, seeing the lesson, seeing the psalm, seeing whatever you were writing about in this sort of new, different way. And I can remember reading so many of them and going, why didn't I think of that? That's just incredible. So I get what you mean. And isn't that kind of what Jesus did? I mean, wasn't Jesus always sort of, turning away from what everybody else was looking at too, to look at and to call other people to look in that direction as well?
Yeah, we all have our own Jesus or our own favorite Jesus, but I love his attentiveness to the things most people were ignoring. The person in the temple who wasn't drawing much attention to herself, or the laborers in the field who showed up late, or, the woman kneading her bread, but it's sort of like the crowd was looking there and he looked over there and saw something remarkable, whether it was lilies in a field or birds in the air. But he's my exemplar in terms of what people who love Buddhism today would call mindfulness, but I would just call it Christian attentiveness. It's right there in the exemplar of the tradition. Pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. Look again, look again.
You said the other day when we were talking that that spirituality looks different in the last third of life than it did in the first 2/3 of life. Would you say some more about that? I'd love to know what you mean.
I will, though it's still forming for me, though it is consuming for me, and partly because I am the age I am, and partly because I love and am married to a man who's 15 years older than I am. So he carries me into the 80s imaginatively, you know, as his partner in life. And we always complain he makes me older than I am and I make him younger than he is, but we meet in the middle. But I've also taken part in a program at Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio that's called, curiously, Forest Dwelling. And it takes off on the continental Indian or Vedic understanding that once you've had your first grandchild or you're that age, it's time to turn your attention to the forest, to think about what matters in life and what doesn't. And you're not available for babysitting because it's time to reread the spiritual classics and polish up on your Sanskrit and, you know, and your mindfulness. So the forest dwelling 2-year program has really focused my attention on how many great heroes of mine, Parker Palmer and Joan Chittister and Richard Holloway in Scotland, and how many people my age-ish are writing about their older age. Interestingly, it used to be called the last half of life, then it was called the last third of life, and now I'm hearing it called the last fourth of life. That's optimistic. but there's work to be done at this age, and I find as I do it and engage it, I get called morbid, you know, or negative or something. But it's about thinking about my legacy and cleaning my closet so my heirs don't have to do that. And deciding how I want to dispose of my resources, and deciding how I wish to live with disability, should that be mine. You know, dementia being my huge fear. And yet when I have walked into that one, I've realized mental function has always been my highest value. So I find a lot of my fears of aging are lifelong fears. They've just gotten concentrated now in the bit of time I have left, however long that turns out to be. But it seems hugely important to me at an age where I'm still physically able and still have some brain cells that work, to acquire whatever vitalities or skills might help me navigate the years I have left. And that's not morbid.
No,
if anything,
it's
it's about coming home. It's about coming home and paying some attention to where I'm headed, and resisting the temptations to stay busy and productive and have a big, healthy following on some social media platform. I mean, it's not to put any of those things down, because mercy, are they providing life for a lot of us, you know, virus shut-ins right now. But at any rate, it has turned out to be really intriguing to read the wise people of aging. In fact, do you know Bishop Stephen Charleston?
Sure.
Yeah, he's just written a book called Ladder into the Light. I just read it today in Galleys. What a beautiful book. You know, a lifetime of wisdom from a Choctaw Native American elder, bishop in the Episcopal Church, who has put together this fabulous book. But I can't get enough of these things. It's like, I don't know what, wisdom literature. Wisdom literature.
Yeah, it's wisdom.
Yeah.
And so what, do you have a piece of advice you would give someone who's just starting, just moving into this last quarter, last third, whatever it is of life?
Oh, and we don't know, do we? A good friend of mine died 2 weeks ago, you know, at 71, just was taking dinner to somebody and fell down dead on the doorstep. So I always am counting on some nice long illness where I have time to get used to being infirm, but there's no guarantee. We don't know what fraction of our life it is now. You know, the best I can come up with now is some of the material I explored in Learning to Walk in the Dark, and that is to stay 1 minute longer with my discomfort, because I have a terror of non-being. And to stay 1 minute longer with that every day is a huge triumph. To just take a breath and learn from whoever I can. But that practicing of walking into the not known seems to me like a godly practice. So that's what I'm doing. So my advice is everybody will have a whole different life history of death and loss and aging. And the parents, they're remembering the parents. I'm remembering. I lost a sister last November, my younger sister. So, we all have different histories that will inform advice, so that generic advice won't be helpful. But I'll tell you, there are a lot of wise people out there we can all gather from.
I know that you've written about loss and experienced, as you just mentioned, a fair amount of loss in your own life. What are you finding these days, or are you finding things these days that help you and that might help others as we're dealing with so much loss all around us, not only loss of life, but loss of hopes, loss of the new job, loss of the graduation, loss of the opportunities. Things are very different now. What are you finding that's most sustaining during this weirdness?
And it'll be only my answer, right? But one of the stages of death that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross left out was hilarity. That somewhere in those stages you just crack up at how ridiculous it all is, or how funny some trivial thing is, or how wonderful it is to be with this person you love who won't be here to love a whole lot longer. So some kind of sense of humor, which I like to define in the old way of maintaining a sense of proportion. Everybody dies. I think it was Ram Dass who said, dying is perfectly safe. Everybody does it. and that kind of goofy, laughter is a great help. But I also have found myself remembering a sentence from Walter Brueggemann, and here it is: love it or hate it. He said, "The world for which you have been so carefully prepared is being taken away from you by the grace of God." I just sat with that like a Zen koan of the first part, which is true. The life for which any of us has been so carefully prepared, really not just now, anytime, is being taken away from us. That's a true part. But the second part is such a faith kind of thing to examine. By the grace of God, what the hell does that mean? To walk around that one and to think what that might mean has taken me out to the edges of my ability to say, come on then, even if it's my own death, come on then, God, please give me resources. But what if our favorite boundaries, our safest structures, our most precious certainties are taken away from us by the grace of God? What would that mean? What would that mean? But see, I think Jesus had, what does it mean to cherish your plans for your life and surrender them on a daily basis? Cherish the plans you've made for your life and give them up over and over and over again. That just seems to me like a deeply, not only Christian, but deeply life-giving. That's ironic, isn't it? Paradoxical. But what's my alternative? The alternative is dive deep into a catfish pond of despair and glub, glub, glub. So anyhow, Brueggemann has had my attention with that phrase lately, and I just commend it to my own prayers because I don't know what I think about it, but I'm intrigued by it.
So the world for which you have been so carefully prepared has been taken away from you by the grace of God.
Yeah, and you got it well. See, and here's the only difference: is being taken away from you. So it's in process. It's present tense. But you, like I didn't have to write it down. The first time I heard him say it, I thought, okay, I'll remember that. So whatever that's about, my advice is,
Isn't it really in some ways about, isn't it Jesus again, to find one's life, one must lose it in some sense.
Yeah, in all kinds of ways. Early on, I thought I had to go get myself killed in the soonest way possible. And I don't think that way anymore because I think life brings suffering no matter what. So I don't think, I won't hold God responsible for willing my suffering. I don't believe that. But I do believe the grace of God is present in everything that comes to me. Pure faith statement. I believe life is for me, not against me. And that is one heck of a challenge every single day. And even more, you asked me this earlier, but a big learning of age has been, I wanted to see things come to fruition in my lifetime. I really measured it from my birth to my death. And everything I was working for was to happen in that period of time. And I've realized now we might be a puff of breath, in whatever it is. We throw our seeds. There's another parable, but my piece in this thing we're in is so brief. It's so small. And I've got a little piece to do, but the fruition, who's got the nerve to talk about fruition? As far as we get gospel wise is until a seed falls to the ground, there's not a hope of any new fruit. So I no longer think of that.
Is it Niebuhr? Is it the old Niebuhr quote that says nothing worth doing is ever accomplished in a single lifetime or something like that?
I love that. I have heard that. I didn't know, to whom to attribute it, but that's where I've come, is realizing not going to happen in my lifetime.
I think that's one of the Niebuhr brothers, I think. I'm not sure which one it is, but
I never know either. One of the R's. Thank goodness they both are. Just say R. Niebuhr and we'll be fine.
Exactly. So let me ask you this question, then we're going to go to questions from everybody else. But because you are such a gifted preacher, and so many of us who walk around with these silly white things on our necks have looked to you and learned from you and been moved and touched by your preaching, do you have any advice that you can give someone who is having to make maybe they're able to go into their church on Sunday morning and get up in their pulpit with nobody in the space the way we do it at the cathedral, or maybe they're having to do it from home and sit in front of their iPhone, but do you have any advice for preachers in the midst of all of this?
Oh, see, and I right away want to say which preacher where. Is it the pastor in my little 200-member church here in Clarksville, Georgia, who says he can't dress up on Sunday, so he just sits in a lawn chair by his creek and talks. Or you're at the National Cathedral. It's a whole different setup. But I think the luckiest preachers are being watched by people who know them and who remember their visits to the hospital and who remembers the confirmation of their children, the baptism of their babies. And that makes every pixel blessed, the minute you see that face, and somebody who's out there trying to do something that he or she's never done before. So that's the great luck of being a resident pastor and somebody who tunes in. But, all I know how to do is keep telling the truth about how unknown this is and how we're making it up as we go along. And I'm loving the new metaphor that we make the way by walking. So all we're being called on to do is put down the next flagstone. So many of us are saying, where are we going? Where's the church going to be in 50 years? What's happening in the United States of America? I don't have a clue, but give me the next muddy place to put a stone down. I can do that. So it helps a ton, I think, to be to be a truth teller, in a confusing time, because you immediately normalize people who feel crazy because they don't have a clue what's going to happen. And when you, with your collar on, with sacred stuff behind you, can say that, the tent gets so much bigger. The human family breathes a huge sigh of relief that even you are not sure.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And that takes, it's one of the greatest gifts that a preacher can give when it's coming from an authentic place, right?
True. Yeah,
all right,
and then go ahead. We're ready to talk to people? Yeah, I'm watching these chats. People are correcting. It was Reinhold Niebuhr, by the way. All these smart people who are listeling to us.
They straight, not H. Richard, but Reinhold. Okay, all right, we got that straight now.
It's Reinhold.
All right, here's Michelle. Michelle Nibley, our director of programs here at the Cathedral, has been keeping track of some of the questions that have been popping up, and so she's going to share some of them. Michelle?
Yeah, thanks so much.
Uh-oh, we lost Michelle.
Oh. Uh-oh.
No, I think it was my connection. Go ahead. I'm
okay.
sorry.
Well, let me know if I disappeared. I'll turn my video off and be a disembodied voice. Ironic, wouldn't it be, if that happened to me instead of Barbara?
You with all your megabytes.
So continuing on this theme of loss and also looking forward, There's a lot of questions about the future of the church, which you've talked about already, but this one felt particularly poignant. There's a lot of concern about people leaving the church. And there's clearly also a hunger for communion with the divine, being in community, wisdom, and serving everywhere in these moments, right? So the question is, how might churches respond to this need?
To this what? What was your last word?
To the need for being in community, for seeking wisdom, right? People are hungry for this, but the institutional church is not necessarily where they're coming right now. So how might churches answer some of those questions or respond?
Where I live, all you have to do is look around, see where people are gathering, whether, I mean, not this moment, but, the Soquel River keepers wade in the Chattahoochee and pick up trash. And there are people who gather at the public library. Book groups are like para-church organizations all over my tiny little town, where people get together to read Jayber Crow by Wendell Berry and end up sharing handkerchiefs. Or I now am part of a little tiny group that is just a little one street neighborhood in town. And we get together socially, distantly appropriate, but, around a fire pit and watch the stars come out and talk. And frankly, that group, I haven't asked them, so I hope none of them are watching, but most of them don't attend church anymore, but they have the most blessed memories of when they did. And so they've become church for each other in this time. So, I always have some kind of confidence that if I lick my finger and hold it up to the wind, I'll find where the Spirit's blowing and investigate it, because there's always time for the church to join the Spirit where the Spirit is, right? Even if the Spirit isn't blowing people through the doors of the church, which it is also doing in a lot of places. It's amazing how many people are also showing up now, whether it's online or they'll be there in person later, but who never had a need to investigate this before and will be coming back. So I have no clue about the future of the church. I just know that the diversity of the ways in which we're being church right now is fascinating. And when I get real extreme, I think about the destruction of the temple in 70 CE and how that was the end of the building, and of the way it had been done and of the priesthood. And Judaism had to find a way to survive, and it did, for 2,000 years. So I wouldn't expect that script to be repeated, but to remember that everything came to an end. And then it went on in a whole different form. I'm ready for that. Don't know what I'm talking about. Happened before.
Well, and the people who were there had to live into whatever the next step was, right?
Yeah, and in that place, it was a diaspora, it was a scattering, and it was a reexamination, not only the written tradition of Torah, but the creation and proliferation of Talmud, of all the oral interpretations of what Torah could mean in different times and places without a priesthood, without the regular festivals, etc. So there was a way in which the teachings had to extend themselves into an unforeseen future. And what that would look like for us, I don't know, but there's great hope in that story for me.
Well, there is a sense right now that, given the fact that the vast majority of us can't get into our churches, that in some ways we have lost the temple, right? And in this sort of digital landscape, we're having to recreate it all in different ways.
Yeah, and there are all these interesting books coming out called Forest Church or Church in the Wild, or it's almost anticipating different places, physical structures, and probably human structures as well, hierarchical structures, whatever, but different ways we have ordered, our religious lives will shift. But it is interesting to see some ways people are reimagining our future, and that will spell disaster for some, a loss of pensions and places and histories and baptismal fonts, and for others it will spell a new opening they have never imagined before because they couldn't go into those places or wouldn't go into those places, or so it'll cut both ways.
Yeah. Well, that's a really lovely segue. There's a lot of people who would love for you to speak about holy envy and some of the things that you might have learned from other traditions or falling in love with other religions or other ways of being with God, and in particular some questions about how other religions or traditions might inform what we're learning about how to be church in this time.
Sure, this is a time for me to say, read that book. It's a really good book. So, but it is the story of my walking through all of that. And I think in a way I've already talked about this hour, it was about being in beginner's mind everywhere I went and always seeing the best in other traditions, always the best in them and the worst in mine, always. It's just like you go to somebody else's house for dinner and think, God, there's such a better family than we are. So I was in beginner's mind a lot. But in that same Stephen Charleston book I just talked about, he said, I have a suggestion for your next interfaith gathering. He says, when you're with Buddhists and Muslims and Jews and Christians and Sikhs, ask them to show you pictures of their children and get them to tell you stories about their grandchildren. And I thought that was such a lovely thing, which is what we have most in common is our humanity, and to discover it thriving in these unusual places, with people who speak differently than I do and imagine the divine differently than I do and pray differently than I do, to find that we laugh about the same things, and we have children, and we love, and we hurt, and we want, and we're scared, and we're joyful, and it's I don't know what it's like. The zoo. It's like all the cages in the zoo went down, only none of us ate each other. We just went off and became the kingdom. I know that's a little Pollyanna-ish. See what happens when I go off script? Who knows what I'll say?
That's the great one. I like that one though. That's a great one.
It's the lion and the lamb, right? Isn't that what happens?
Yeah, and I've been in, ideal kinds of situations with hosts who have welcomed students and welcomed me, and I've never walked cold into a place, which would be a rude thing to do, frankly. So, but I have experienced none of my fears come true, and far more than my fondest hopes come true.
That's so lovely. There's a particularly poignant question here. You mentioned when you were talking about where church is happening in the world that we might stumble across it or we might find it. You mentioned the fond memories that many of those people have of their other experiences of church. And one of the folks who's here tonight wrote a question about trying to find her way back into church and to find God after some really painful experiences of childhood church that were exclusive or unwelcoming. And what would you say to the folks who are trying to find their way back after something so painful?
I'm always scared of those big questions because they won't apply to, if I answer 5 people, it won't apply to all of them. And the answers range from a friend of mine who found his way into an 8 a.m., old-fashioned Victorian liturgy and found that like the best healing place in the world because nobody touched him.
Oh.
What he needed was to be in a place where nobody touched him, and the language was like a rocking chair, and it was just so healing for him. And other people have been really saved by walking into a kind of community they never thought they'd go into, that's in a 10 building with a bunch of movable chairs. And all of a sudden there are people in there with beards and blue jeans and little kids crawling through the chair spokes, and somebody up on a stage and music they thought they hated until they started singing a refrain. So, for somebody else, that's the thing. For other people, online is going to be, because see, I think safety is going to be important in this, safety and welcome. And so it depends on the nature of the injury. What the cure will be has got to have something to do with the injury or the illness. So I can imagine a lot of different scenarios for how someone might find a way back in again. But my advice is sit in the back pew until you feel like moving to the back pew, because I think self-protection is a gift of the spirit, to a certain degree, and to not give up your sense of the dearness of yourself, the freshness of yourself, and how you deserve safety. So And then one other thing I'd say, Michelle, is it's a huge mistake for any of us to go searching for the ideal community, because it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And I think that when we've been hurt by other places we've been, we launch on the search for the place that will never hurt us. And it doesn't exist. There's not a marriage that doesn't hurt us. There's not a parental relationship that doesn't hurt us. It doesn't exist. And somehow church gets held up to this incredibly unrealistic standard of being the place where no one will ever hurt you. And I think, I don't know how to put those two things together, to protect yourself and to give up the idea there's a place that will be harm-free. You minimize it and do your best, but it's a human institution. So they're going to be welcome to the club. Maybe you'll be the person who hurts instead of the hurtee.
It also makes me think that question might be as much for the rest of us as it is for the person who's trying to find their way back in. That those of us who are
what a wonderful thing to say.
To just remember that sometimes we're the person who can be the welcome, or the help heal.
And to be aware of that, wouldn't that be remarkable? Every single time you're in a sacred space, to remember you might be the person who makes the difference. That's big. That's huge.
So we have a question that's going to come from one of the folks who's here tonight that is unmuted. I'm not sure if it's Matt or Jamie. So would one of you, I think you're both unmuted, would one of you jump in with your question here?
For all of your work. It's been so influential in my spiritual journey. This is Jamie Coleman. I'm on my husband's name, Matthew Eldred here, but I just wanted to ask you if you could talk further about your contrarian language and how that helps us better understand the nature of God and the divine.
Oh, Jamie, you can answer that. What an interesting question, though. I mean, my mind just went about three places. A, for contrarianness, study the Gospels. If you want to see how a contrarian behaves, CF, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then a little Paul also. Contrarians all the way through, and First Testament as well. And then I did already talk about some of the contrarianness, but it seems to me to be a contrarian is to be one of the beloved critics, right? One of the insiders who hangs near the door. And that way I think you can greet those inside, but you can also kind of have a hand outside, not to pull people in. Simone Weil, W-E-I-L, is one of my heroes. And I make, my favorite imagination of her as well, but that she was so drawn to Catholic faith, but refused to be baptized as long as the church held a doctrine of only the baptized, would be in God's presence eternally. So she wouldn't come in, but she sure did hang in the doorway, in love with the teachings, but refusing to come in until all could be in, and that time didn't come. So that maybe because she's an early hero, she has stuck with me as a lovely witness to God as insider and God as outsider, God as ultimate outsider, God as ultimate insider, and how the God who is all is not one or either of those, but both. So God must be a contrarian, or we would not be made in that image, right?
All right. Thank you. Lovely. I've got one more question that's a little forward looking, and then Randy, I'll hand it back over to you to close us out for the night. So there are a couple of questions about what the future might hold for you particularly. And in particular, folks are wondering about whether there are future books that we might be watching out for. Fiction, nonfiction.
Don't I wish? I pray every night, God, give me the gift of fiction writing, please. But it hasn't happened yet. Or poetry. Poetry. I'd love to, God, give me the gift of poetry, but I don't have them. I'm a great appreciator of both. I don't know. I usually listen out for books. I listen to what people are asking me and what they write me about and what they talk about. And the aging piece, just because of where I've been hanging out, is large. And I can't say much more. I'll give my book idea away, right? So there is one I'm going to withdraw with. I have my book stack and I have my notes, and I've been reading a lot. And it has to do with this particular time in our global life, but our national life in particular. But I'm very interested in the vitalities that sustain life at any age, and that it's never too late to start. So there's probably a book on aging. I mean, if Parker Palmer and Joan Chittister and Richard Holloway are doing it, why shouldn't I climb on the bandwagon and do it too? So that one's probably in me. But anybody who dreams of writing books, really think again. Unless you're going to self-publish, then you have the perfect editor and publisher. Otherwise, you're going to be like in a church with real people. Yeah.
Thank you so much for all the questions. I want to say to all the folks who have joined us, we have a whole lot more questions that have come in than we are able to cover right now. But what we will do at the end of this conversation is that we will take all of the comments and all of the questions, and we will package them and share them with Barbara and send them to her so that she will see and have a chance to read the questions and comments that we haven't been able to get to tonight. So please know that. That's one of the great gifts, right? But I want our folks to know that they won't be lost, and they're deeply appreciated. And we're so glad that you would join us tonight as part of this conversation. I could go on, and I would love to go on for another hour. As always, Barbara brings such depth and richness and insight into any conversation. And thank you for that tonight. Thank you for, sitting there with your not so great broadband and with the iron. I love the roses. That's the great gift right there. But thank you for making the time to be with us, because I know that you have a lot going on, and it's a great gift to us.
Oh, I couldn't be happier. This, again, I'm a real virgin Zoomer, but this has been a great experience. So I want to thank not only Randy, but Michelle and Margaret and Caitlin. And I saw some beloved names come up in the chat, Jean and Tricia, Susan B. So lots and lots of people I know and care about are listening, and a bunch I can't wait to read what you have to say or ask. So thank you for the opportunity to hook Clarksville, Georgia, population 1,500, up with Washington, D.C. It's really been a gift.
I'm ready to come. Let's end with a little bit of a prayer, if everyone wouldn't mind. Gracious God, we thank you for the gift of this conversation and this night. We thank you for Barbara Brown Taylor and the gifts she has given to so many for so many years. May you continue to empower her and to enliven her, that she might continue to bless all of us. We pray for all those who are gathered round, that you will keep them safe. We pray for all those who are ill and for all those who are caring for the ill. Watch over them, dear Lord. We need you now more than ever. All these things we lift up in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Thank you all. God bless.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.